So good afternoon. I want to thank you for choosing to spend the next 75 minutes with us. My name is Abigail Abasal Metzger, and I will be facilitating this workshop. I am the representative for Pax Christi International and have been since 2013, the NGO working group at the United Nations, as well as several other Palestinian advocacy groups. And I've been to the Holy Land 3 times. My last visit was with a small delegation of international delegation of Pax Christi members in 2023, in February 2023. So a few things before we start. Hopefully we will have time for questions. So if you do have a question, please put it into the chat. And if you could just capitalize the first few words so I can identify that over a comment, that would be helpful. And also, if you could just make sure you stay muted until later on. Now, I'd like to offer a few personal comments before we start. We're about to engage in a difficult and especially now very painful subject. These last 11 months, we have seen unthinkable horrors, and the loss, sadness, and yes, even anger is unimaginable. I want to suggest that to all of us that as thinking adults, we can hold 2 truths at the same time, and that we don't have to choose between sides, because indeed there are 2 equally potent and historical narratives that deserve to be known and understood. This workshop is entitled, What Catholics Need to Know About Palestine. I'm not sure that Catholics need to know anything more than anybody else. They certainly don't need to know anything less. What I think is that we need to apply our faith to the knowledge we have. And what I mean about that is the theme of the conference is we are all one body. And we need to recognize that both Palestinians and Israelis and all those who live in the land we call holy are equal parts of one body. We are all children of God and deserve dignity and the God-given human rights that we have been provided with. I don't believe that Jesus ever chose sides. I think what he chose was justice, peace, and nonviolence. And that's what we need to choose as well. So we hope that you will leave this workshop with both a general understanding of the history of the region and the context within which the last 11 months have unfolded. You will notice that I try not to use the word war. War implies 2 equal sides, usually. And in fact, this is really an asymmetrical war, if you will, with one power, one actor being a nuclear power and having one of the most advanced military forces in the world. I'm going to spend a few minutes sharing information as I think it's really critically important that Americans know and understand both the history and the current facts on the ground, because we have, as Americans, enabled both. The US was the first country to formally recognize the state of Israel in 1948. And since then, we have been their strongest ally and protector. Israel has been the largest cumulative recipient of US foreign aid. In 2016, the US signed a 3rd Memorandum of Understanding with Israel, which guarantees that they will receive $3.8 billion a year in military aid. Yet, Israel is the 14th richest country per capita in the world, with one of the most advanced military forces. And over the last 11 months, in addition to the millions of dollars that we have allocated and the shipment of military equipment, there's been an outpouring of money from Americans. And one of the reasons that this is important is that most of it is tax deductible, which means we're losing tax income. $1.4 billion has been donated, either from individuals or organizations to Israel, and most of those are tax deductible. 58,000 Americans have volunteered to either fight in the army or to work in agricultural land or with nonprofits, and another $1.7 billion, has been raised by the sale of Israeli bonds, and 300 million of this has been come from American state and local governments. It's important to note that one of the requirements of our military assistance to Israel is that they buy their equipment from the US, which means that US manufacturers of equipment are making a lot of money on the arms that they sell to Israel. Thus, most of the bombs and other military equipment that has caused the 40,000 plus deaths in Gaza and the utter destruction of the Strip are American made. And this is important because it's your tax dollars that are funding this. In addition, it's important to recognize the political and diplomatic cover that the US gives to Israel, especially in the United Nations. The importance of this cannot be overstated, as we all saw the US vetoing resolutions for a ceasefire. Now, before we hear from our panelists, and I promise you will, I'd like to set the stage with a very brief overview of the history. Again, it's essential to understand that the horrors of October 7th be put in context. It didn't begin on October 7th. And while that is sometimes difficult to hear and many people take issue with it, it's the truth. The first Zionist Congress was held in Switzerland in 1897. And at that time, the father of Zionists, Theodor Herzl, put forth the idea of a Jewish state. Jews in England were experiencing horrible acts of anti-Semitism, and he determined that they would never be safe other than in a country of their own. However, Palestine was only one of several locations that was suggested. The first wave of immigrants to Palestine began in the late 1800s and increased on the years following, especially as the pogroms in Russia increased and intensified in strength. There had always been a Jewish presence in Palestine, mostly religious Jews, but this new wave of immigrants was different. They sought to establish a country, their country. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration was signed with the English government, offering their support for the establishment of a Jewish homeland. Now, note that the word is homeland, not state. As World War I came to a close, the League of Nations was created, and it placed Palestine under a British mandate in 1918. Immigration to Palestine continued. As the Arabs began to see that their land was now being settled, and for the most part, they were no longer able to work on the land as they had in the past. Most had absentee landlords, but the Palestinian people, Jews came to settle. They wanted to establish Jewish-only working land, so they were losing their jobs as well. There were outbursts of violence, especially in 1929 and in the late 1930s. And at this time, the world was also obviously seeing the rise of Nazism. And as the Jews began to flee Europe, the doors began to close in the US and in European countries. Palestinian anger towards the British, as well as the increase in Jewish immigration, continued to grow. During the years preceding the establishment of the State of Israel, forgive me for reading, intense fighting between the Arabs, the British, and the military forces increased. They were all sort of fighting with each other. The Jews were just as unhappy with the British as the Arabs were. There were documented massacres and wholesale elimination of Palestinian villages. In 1948, the British ended their mandate, and its future became Palestine became the responsibility of the United Nations. A note, that's not right. Sorry. I don't have all my papers in order. Sorry for that. Okay, so when the British ended their mandate of Palestine and its future became the responsibility of the United, and on May 14th, 1948, Ben Gurion, who would become the first prime minister, announced the newly formed state of Israel. And the Arab countries revolted, and so ensued the fighting. At the start of the fighting, Jews owned approximately 8% of historic Palestine. By the end of 1949, when the armistice was signed, Israel was given 77.4% of the land. In the span of those years, 750,000 Palestinians were either forcibly displaced or under duress of fear left. Over 350 villages and towns were completely destroyed in an effort to minimize any chance of people returning. Palestinians call this the Nakba, or catastrophe, and it is seared into the hearts and minds of all Palestinians, but especially those who remained refugees in the West Bank and Gaza. Now we're going to fast forward to 1967, which ended with Israel occupying, the war ended with Israel occupying the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and Sinai. And since that time, Palestinians in the West Bank have been under military occupation, which means that they live by a different set of laws than anybody else. They live by military law. Their judicial system is a military system and it is not civil, which really does impact. I think the percentage of cases that are there's a 98% conviction rate in the military court. As the occupying power, Israel has certain responsibilities and is expected to respect the laws of international law. One of the most important one of these is that an occupying power cannot move its own people into the occupied land, and therefore all of the settlements that are continuing to grow are a breach of international law and are considered illegal. Many of the Palestinians who were displaced during the 1967 war and afterwards are refugees in Gaza. A note about those Palestinians who remained in Israel proper. They consist of about 20% of Israeli population. They have citizenship, but there are approximately 65 laws on the books that are specifically discriminatory against Palestinian citizens of Israel, sort of like a little bit like our Jim Crow. Residents of East Jerusalem are yet another category. They do not have citizenship. They have something called residency, and their residency permit can be revoked at any time. There are, in fact, 5 different Israeli residency cards, each with different rules and restrictions. Now we're going to take another leap to after the Oslo Accords were signed. At the end of these talks in 1993, the West Bank was divided into 3 sections, and this is what you'll hear now. Area A, which constitutes 18% of the land, is under Palestinian Authority, both for administrative and security. However, the IDF can go into Area A at any time. Area B, which constitutes 22% of the land, is administered by the Palestinian Authority for things like garbage and roads and things like it's an administrative, but the security is under Israel. And Area C, which contains the most fertile agricultural land and natural resources, is 60% of the land, and that is completely under Israeli control. And Scott will share with you what life is like in the West Bank, explaining movement restrictions, house demolitions, settlement expansion, etc. Now, let's see. Now we're going to turn to Gaza, and that could probably take a semester or more. But the bottom line, in 2005, Israel disengaged from Gaza. They removed all of their settlements. However, they always kept a buffer and control over land between Gaza Strip and Israel. And the strip is about 25 miles long and is bordered on the south by Jordan and on the north by Egypt. In 2006, Hamas won the Palestinian legislative elections and took over administrative control of the Gaza Strip. The elections were monitored by the Carter Center and were deemed fair and impartial. It is important to note that Hamas is both an administrative, a political, and a military entity. It is not purely military, and it was the sole source of any social or administrative services in the Gaza Strip. But essentially, it's a ideology, and that's one of the reasons that many people say that you can't win or completely eliminate Hamas. It's part of the culture. At the time of Hamas's win, Israel established a total blockade of the Gaza Strip, and it controlled all of its borders, land borders, its airspace, and the sea, how far into nautical miles fishermen were able to go. And as you can imagine, fishing was a primary source of income for Gazans. That is why Gaza is known as the largest open air prison. Its 2.2 million residents are completely at the mercy of Israel, who has full control over what goes in and what goes out, who goes in and who comes out. And this includes everything from tomatoes to X-ray machines, from flashlights to antibiotics. They control everything. The restrictions on Gaza exports has severely damaged the economy. And before the onslaught, nearly 80% of all Gazans were in need of humanitarian aid. Yet Gazans are one of the most highly educated people in the world. Another piece of information that impacts the current situation. As of April 22, Israel was holding approximately 4,400 security prisoners, 160 which were children, and 62 were women. Another 1,000 were held under something called administrative detention. Administrative detention is a process by where a person is held, obviously in detention. However, they are not charged, nor do they go before any kind of court. And their case is completely sealed so that they don't know what they're being charged with, and their lawyers don't know what they're being charged with. The administrative detention can be renewed as often as the Israeli judicial system wants it to be. And therefore, many people are held in administrative detention for many years. And these numbers have exploded over the last 11 months with new evidence and reports. Amnesty International just put out a report of the systemic torture and abuse that is going on. So that lays very quickly a incredibly brief brushstroke of history and the situation. So now I'm going to turn it over to our panelist, Scott, who's going to talk about his recent trip to the Holy Land, is the former director of the Columban Office for Justice, Peace, and Ecology in Washington, D.C., and the Columban Mission in El Paso, Texas. He's a longtime member of Pax Christi USA and was given the title of Ambassador of Peace by Pax Christi. He has worked for 8 years accompanying refugees and displaced communities in El Salvador during the war in the 1980s. And in addition to the delegation that he just came back from, he had been there in March on the Stones Cry Out delegation. And I'm going to add, because he didn't in his bio, that he's married to Jean Stoken, who is a longtime dedicated member of Pax Christi and also the coordinator, justice coordinator of the Sisters of Mercy. And they just had a beautiful little new granddaughter. So Joryán is a scholar practitioner pursuing a PhD in peace studies and theology at the University of Notre Dame. He was born in San Antonio de los Banos, Cuba, and immigrated to the US when he was 9. His research entails how religious actors can help alleviate the traumas of displacement and present theologies of hope in and for Latin immigrant communities, focusing on the Cuban diaspora. As a burgeoning, reflexive, and I would love him to explain that, peace builder and theologian, he strives for his academic work to engage deeply with the lived experiences of conflict-affected regions, where cycles of violence have long shaped human interactions. He aims to ensure the scholarly reflections resonate with and are informed by the harsh realities on the ground. Lasya is a graduate student in sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and is a member of the leadership team of the Pax Christi Young Adult Caucus. At UW, their research focuses on transnational economic justice and international political economy, and they also teach classes on queer studies. They grew up in India and attended Mount Holyoke College, where they gained experience in interfaith organizing and intergroup dialogue facilitation. Though their work with the Adult Caucus, their hope is to help facilitate intergenerational relationships in peace and justice work. Both Joryán and Lasya were active in the student encampments on their campuses, and they will help us understand both why and how they became involved and what they learned from those experiences. So I turn it over to Scott.
Thank you, Abigail. And thank you for laying that very helpful foundation for what the three of us will share. I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint, but before that, I'd just like to acknowledge some of you, perhaps many of you, were at the 12 o'clock session and even the last night's session. But I thought the theme for this weekend, Pax Christi, is challenging one. What does it mean to be a prophetic church in a time of polarization and conflict? And now for this workshop, what does that mean in the context of the struggle in Israel and Palestine? And I would like to highlight or invite us also into the space. Where are we in that picture? As US citizens, as part of a church, hopefully a prophetic church, because we're not neutral actors. We're very much a part of this story, and not always a very helpful part of the story. But let me begin with the PowerPoint. Let's see if I can bring that up. I'm going to screen share. And can you see that?
Yep.
Yep, looks great.
Okay. So I'll go, there's only 15 slides. I'll do a few introductory ones just about our delegation, but spend most of the time on what we saw and heard on the ground. But what you see here, Jordan at the noon hour shared a little about Christians for a ceasefire. Who are we? This was kind of an ad hoc response after the October 7th attack and the beginning of the bombing in Gaza. This picture, I believe, is from November 2nd. It was kind of a first public response, a first public protest about ongoing US support for the bombing of Gaza. And in the spring, Christians for a Ceasefire began to grow. It's very ecumenical, but it also has some interfaith participation. There's a group called Rabbis for a Ceasefire, who we've joined together with. And in August, Christians for Ceasefire organized 2 delegations to Palestine. Let me see if I can bring up the next. I'm going to have to do this. Okay. So we were invited by the Palestinian Christian community in Palestine to, as you can see from the letter there, stand in solidarity with us, be a voice for the voiceless, help amplify the call for peace and justice. So the communities who convened us, you'll see Sabil, an ecumenical liberation theology group, Kairos Palestine, which is inspired by Kairos, South Africa, and the Reverend Munter Isaac, who's just been on a US tour, is the Lutheran pastor in Bethlehem. So I think this invitation, what does it mean to be invited? I mean, here's a letter. In some sense, it's part of our tradition, local churches inviting solidarity from other local churches. But, you know, at the noon hour, Ruben Garcia from Annunciation House was speaking of the power of example, how we, through the choices we make, through our solidarity, through the risks that we take, hopefully we inspire one another. So there's the invitation of that mutual solidarity with one another. But there's also, and I think for many of us, why did we go on this delegation? Why did we go now? And why us? You know, is the invitation that comes from the deep, deep suffering of people, migrants at the border. You know, the Jesuits in Central America used to speak of crucified people, but the suffering, you know, initially October 7th was horrific suffering of those who were taken hostage or who were murdered by Hamas. But then on a daily basis, and we're now 336 days into the bombing and invasion and killing in Gaza, that suffering is so profound. It's not a suffering in competition with any other suffering, but it is one that calls us to solidarity. Sabiel, some of you may know them. I believe they were founded in the 1980s. Reverend Naim Atik, an Episcopal priest, and those, you know, Christians in Palestine are less than 1% of the population. So it's a very small minority, but a very significant one because of their own solidarity with, as Palestinians, with Palestinian Muslims, and their own connection to and suffering under the occupation in the West Bank and in Gaza and East Jerusalem. But I thought, you know, this is, they have their own call as Palestinian Christians. What do they do? How do they respond to Gaza? How do they respond to the occupation? How do they respond to 1948, the Nakba, the catastrophe, and the ongoing catastrophe that Palestinians are experiencing? I was in Palestine 2015 with Pax Christi, but this last February and March, I was in Bethlehem. We stayed at the church of Reverend Munter Isaac. And, you know, when I think about, well, why do we go? You know, there's, in the Gospel of John, there's come and see for yourself. And also in the letter of John, it says, well, when you go back, then share what you have seen and heard and touched, this word of life. And, you know, in the midst of horrific death and suffering and injustice, there is life. There is life. So what we heard in March and what we heard again 6 months later in the August delegation. I'm simply repeating what we heard. That Christmas homily from Muntari Sak, if Jesus were born today, he would be born in the rubble. Over and over, many people said, this is a US war. Without your weapons and diplomatic cover at the UN, this would not be happening. You are a party to genocide. These are Palestinian words, Christian words. Don't talk to us about international law or human rights, they say. There's a double standard, Ukraine and Israel. As Christians in the West, we are profoundly complicit and have been for generations. So those are hard words to hear, but I think they're truthful words. So what do we do with them? And again, although we spent most of our time 6 days, 3 in East Jerusalem, 3 in the West Bank, and then the last day we were at the Gaza border, a mile from Egypt, a mile from Khan Yunis, a mile from the kibbutzes that were attacked October 7th. Gaza was very present. So numbers, but think of, if you go on social media, if you go on Facebook, if you go wherever, you can see daily dramatic, traumatic scenes of people fleeing, of bombings that have occurred, of injured people, particularly children taken to hospitals, children in hospitals. So we can't think 40,000 dead. We have to think one by one by one. What does that mean? And then the incredible forcibly displaced people. It's 90% of the people. And many times over, there is no place to go. What do you do? How do you live? How do you survive in such a place? And then the massive destruction not seen since the bombing of civilian cities in World War II. The starvation, the polio, infectious diseases. And then, again, words you mentioned. So, and those meaning for us today. What's happening? So we had heard in March that people were fearful in the West Bank that what was happening in Gaza could happen subsequently in the West Bank. Perhaps not so much the bombing, but certainly the aggression, the demolition, the forced relocation. And, a word that I think has meaning as well, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians over time, and particularly since the Nakba in 1948. So we just saw in the days leading up to the invasion, the largest invasion by the Israeli army into the West Bank in 20 years, we saw the days leading up to that accompanying Palestinian communities that either were under threat of or had been attacked by Israeli settlers, and including deaths, including burning of vehicles and bridges, etc. So it's a traumatic situation for the people there, but also in going there. I'll just mention that 12 of us on the delegation, we thought, well, are we crazy? There's about to become a regional war. In the first days of the delegation, we were under the possibility that Iran was going to strike, Hezbollah was going to strike. And then, of course, the settler violence, aggression by the Israeli Defense Forces, etc. But we went, and I think that was a grace. And that's what people spoke about last night and at noon, about the prophetic church. How do we become a church not only of encounter, but a church of risk? How do we empower one another to place ourselves in places of vulnerability, accompanying vulnerable communities like the Palestinians? Because that's who we are as a prophetic church. That's who we are as Christians. So the settler violence, it's in East Jerusalem, the picture on the left. Bakri Abu Diab is, represents 60,000 Palestinians in East Jerusalem, and they're under settler threats and demolition of their homes to leave East Jerusalem. That's his home in the background. On the right is a Bedouin community, those two pictures. They had been on the land 30 years, were attacked by Israeli settlers 2 days before, and we're fleeing to a safe place. And we met settlers, we met the Israeli Defense Forces. The picture on the left, Lasya Kasiya, she and her family have been just outside Bethlehem in this UNESCO preserved beautiful region, green region, the Makur Valley. Their home and their restaurant had been demolished by Israeli settlers. And this is a picture days later, taken just days after we left, of her incredibly courageous standing up to the settlers, and was beaten, and she and her mother were detained overnight and then released. So what are we seeing? The important thing, I think, is the reality on the ground. Don't let words cover over what we Palestinians are experiencing day by day by day. But words can be meaningful. I mean, the International Court uses the word genocide. Different persons have used the word apartheid. And I don't think it's rhetoric, but we have to begin with the reality on the ground to give meaning to those words. And just shortly before he came, the International Court of Justice ruled, as people have said and human rights groups have said for decades, that the 1967 occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem is illegal, and the Israeli government is obligated to evict this 500,000 settlers in the West Bank and make reparations to the Palestinians who lost their homes. That's a huge charge, but we can't, we in the US know what American exceptionalism is, and that has to be, we can't accept that, nor can we accept Israeli exceptionalism. We need to be a community that abides by international law and human rights standards. United Nations refugee camps. This is a camp in Nablus that we visited. The night after our visit, it was attacked by Israeli Defense Forces. They fired into the streets, into several homes, and I think some people were wounded. But refugee camps are incredibly vulnerable places, and they are constantly invaded and sometimes attacked. There are 8.5 million Palestinian refugees outside of Israel and Palestine. And that's a huge challenge, because Palestinians will speak of the right of return. So we have to go back not only to 1967, but to 1948, because that was the beginning of the forced relocation of so many Palestinians. I'll move quickly. So nonviolence. We did a training online with some Palestinians about nonviolence. And for them, it was amazing, because I think here in the US, often we think of civil disobedience action, a campaign. But for them, they said, this is our way of life, simply to wake up in the morning on land that is ours in the face of forced relocation or aggression from settlers or Israeli army. We just to go about our life, our daily life, is a form of nonviolence. Isra Amro in Hebron has been called the Palestinian Gandhi. It was written up New York Times, May 1st. Iyad Bernat, that whole land struggle, 20 years, documented in an amazing film called Five Broken Cameras. We met with each of them. And Daoud Nasser from the Tent of Nations. Their land title goes back, to the Ottoman Empire, and they have been under aggression encircled by Israeli settlements. And I love their values. We refuse to be victims. We refuse to hate. We refuse to be enemies. We believe justice will triumph. We did meet with families of the hostages, and you can't help but feel empathy. You can't help but feel the tragedy. I mean, it reminded me from other Central American settings of mothers of the disappeared, etc. That human phenomena of losing a loved one, or a loved one disappeared or taken hostage. Look them in the eyes. I mean, it's moving to be in those spaces. And also moving because they have been at the heart of opposing their government and calling for a ceasefire, bringing the hostages home. We also, the last day, had an interfaith service at the Gaza border. Rabbis for Human Rights with a Muslim sheikh. 1 mile, we could hear the bombing of Khan Yunis. We were just a mile away. We could see, the border of Egypt, and we passed through. So Rabbi Avi Dabush, who's speaking on the left, survived that attack by Hamas. He was with his wife and children. But amazing capacity. Rabbis for Human Rights opposing the occupation. Rabbi Avi Dabush said he remembers his parents, one who was Syrian, Muslims, and in some cases, children between one community and the other were nursed by families, Jewish by Muslim, Muslim by Jewish. There's that kind of living together. And then he used this phrase from the river to the sea. I'll come to that, but just to note that he used that phrase, and he used it in a very inclusive way. He said, it is possible for us as Israelis and Jews to live together. Palestinian sea means that sharing of one land together. So from the interfaith service, we went to a military base. And we presented our protests. You can see in the signs. An arms embargo. I mean, that is important. That's where we are in the story. We are funding day by day. And the complete lack of restraint from the Biden administration or the State Department on these negotiations, I think just it makes people all the more cynical. Because we have the capacity, if we're funding the war, we have the capacity to put pressure on the Israeli government to stop bombing Gaza, to begin to negotiate with the Palestinians. And then, the question is, so how far back do we go? To 1967, 1948? So from the river to the sea, this is this vision. And I mentioned 3 organizations on the right because they are Palestinians and Israelis working together with a common vision of at least a ceasefire, but more often than not, to end the occupation of the West Bank. And the pictures there on the left, from the protests, we went to a food distribution center with Israeli Jews and with Palestinian Muslims and Christians to package food for Gaza. We were 1 mile from the border. But it's a drop in the bucket. 5 trucks will go in. Before October 7th, there were 500 trucks going in. That's standing together. We were with them, the Parents Circle Family Forum, Pax Christi International in 2023. There are families, Palestinian and Jewish families who have lost loved ones in over the years, the past 20 years. They're working together. Combatants for Peace, both Jewish and Palestinian ex-combatants are working together. And one place they showed up in solidarity with Palestinian families that were under threat of being removed by Jewish settlers. So there is that kind of interfaith, inter-solidarity among communities. Okay, and just to end, what can we do to make difference? So for me, this is some of the things I heard, some of the things that helped me make sense. You know, there's 2 narratives, the Holocaust and the Nakba. We know, or at least our generation grew up with stories of the Holocaust, and it was beautiful to be on this delegation. It was very intergenerational and to learn from one another, because depending on what generation we grew up with, we have different stories to tell. But Palestinians will say the Holocaust happened on European soil. We had nothing to do with it, but we're being punished for it. Respect for international law, I think we have to abide by those rulings. Defend human rights. What happened October 7th was a war crime, murder and taking of hostages. But what's been happening day by day, 336 days in Gaza, is crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. And what's the solution? I think more and more people said it's one land. We have to work this out as Israelis and Palestinians. What's our obligation? An arms embargo, stop funding the genocide, restrain and push the Israeli government to a ceasefire. At home, we have to oppose anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, Christian nationalism. And finally, you know, just yesterday, an American citizen was shot to death after the protest. A half hour, the protest ended, and she was shot by an Israeli soldier in the head. So to remember Rachel Corrie, who was killed by an Israeli bulldozer 20 years ago, and to remember Aysanur Ezgi Egi Presente. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Scott. That was beautifully and truthfully said. I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen here.
Thank you, Joryán, for picking it up.
Of course.
Now we understand why you were both in the streets.
Thank you. Can you all see my my PowerPoint? Perfect.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, first of all, thank you all so much just for your presence, for being here. Thank you, Abigail, for the introduction. And just so grateful to Pax Christi USA for just their solidarity and support toward this this movement and toward the Palestinian people since October 7th and long before October 7th, really. So I want to start by emphasizing that contrary to what the vast majority of academia teaches, I believe emotions are valid data and sources of knowledge and should be taught as such. My identity as a scholar is not rooted in the objectivism of modern science, which stems from the Enlightenment in Western Europe. You know, Descartes, for example, begins his scientific method with doubt, doubting the senses, emotions, the relationships, etc., because these things cannot be taken as true. They're not verifiable. The only thing, according to Descartes, that I can know for sure is that I can think. Therefore, the only thing that matters is my mind. It's a split between my body and my mind, and a split between myself and others. According to Descartes, everything in the world besides myself is an object to be studied. And these ideas of thinkers like Descartes, Isaac Newton, and others have influenced how knowledge is pursued, attained, and passed down, even in the fields of theology and peace studies, and their attempt as disciplines to prove themselves as objective fields with scientific or verifiable data and methodology. Now, you may be asking yourselves, what does any of this have to do with my involvement in calling for peace in Gaza and Notre Dame? Well, the way I see it, the objectivist focus of academia influences the conception that if we know what the cause of a conflict is, then we know how to solve the conflict, no matter where in the world the conflict is happening. But I believe that only emotions really can lead us to address the death-dealing realities of a conflict and how to build peace. I believe emotions are crucial to making decisions. Emotions are often revealed to the world through an individual's outward behavior, such as gestures, tone of voice, posture, manner of speaking. We know this. These physical expressions act as visible cues, allowing others to interpret and understand the underlying emotional state. Emotions are widely recognized as intricate experiences encompassing physical, cognitive, and social and relational elements, both in interactions with others and within ourselves. These dimensions shape how individuals perceive and respond to their emotional states. Viewed in these ways, emotions carry epistemological value. They should be considered valid data for making decisions, such as determining when and how to get involved in the pro-Palestinian movement. It is through this lens that, in a vulnerable manner, I would like to share my own experiences of pro-Palestine campus encampments. I came to this movement rather late. Despite the emphasis on trauma healing, liberation theologies, and theologies of resistance within my own life as a PhD student, my involvement in the months following October 7th was limited by the fact that I was in survival mode that semester. Not only was that semester the most rigorous part of my coursework, but only 3 months prior, I had received news of my father's passing. Grieving my father's death took an unforeseeable toll on my mental health. And it just so happened that the weekend of October 7th, I was experiencing the worst depressive episode of my life. My body and my soul, my emotional state was telling me as the genocide unfolded that I could not be present for this movement because I could barely even be present for myself. Thankfully, through God's grace and the amazing support system I had already cultivated here in South Bend, as well as my therapist, of course, I got through that semester. That Christmas break that followed, I allowed myself to rest and bathe in the care of loved ones. This helped me a lot in my grieving process, and also as I received really hard news before the end of last year, of the passing of one of my best friends from undergrad to cancer. In January, I returned to South Bend a couple of weeks before the new semester begins. And as I get ready to fly to Florida for a gathering to celebrate my great friend's life, a winter storm sweeps through Indiana. I open up Uber and Lyft to order a ride to the airport. 10 minutes pass, 20 minutes pass, and nothing. I get in my car, ready to drive through the unplowed roads of South Bend on that early morning, only to find out that my car battery had died. 30 minutes pass and still no Ubers or Lyfts available. So I missed my flight. Now, the previous day, one of my best friends in South Bend, a fellow PhD student who would end up being arrested alongside me, had invited me to an off-campus protest. I feel moved to reach out to him, and he ends up driving in the still unplowed streets to pick me up, make some signs, and attend my first protest in support of Gaza. I only attended 3 or 4 protests or marches on and off campus the rest of the semester. The last 2 times we gathered on campus ended with aggressive police interference, with the final one ending with the arrest of 16 students and 1 staff member. Now, I won't get into too much detail of that evening because honestly, the prosecutor still hasn't dropped our charges. But I say all of this to make the point that seeking peace is a divine mystery. And to me, that means 2 things. Everyone's involvement looks different. And the only way to make sense of that mystery is through listening to our emotions, to our intuition, to ultimately discern the creativity of what our actions will entail. There were moments when our emotions and the energy surrounding our demonstrations called for poetry. There were moments when they called for song. There were moments when they called for chanting. There were moments when they called for silence. There were moments when they called for prayer. There were moments when they called for sitting down peacefully on the God Quad while being aggressively arrested by Notre Dame's police department. There were moments when they called for filming the aggressive arrest of the people you've been organizing with and grown to love and admire. There were moments when they called for international students to step back because despite months of having the core of their hearts involved in this movement, we knew that their arrest could result in deportation or losing their visa. There were moments when they called for many of those not arrested to stay up until 3 or 4 in the morning, coordinating efforts to release their fellow students from the county jail. There were moments when we had to decide that disciplinary consequences and misdemeanors could not stall the momentum of our solidarity with the Palestinian people. There were moments of tension and division within the group. And ultimately, all of these moments reflect God working through us. And the truth is that being involved in this movement has been the only thing that has alleviated the pain, the anger, and the frustration I've felt every time I attended Mass and witnessed the priests who have been ordained to do God's work either choose to be silent by ignoring the sacred words of love, liberation, peace, and justice, or choose to allow those sacred words of love, liberation, peace, and justice to be turned into bombs and bullets. The pain of going to Mass knowing that so many of the doctrines held by the tradition I have grown to love are being contradicted by that same tradition was unbearable. One of the primary reasons I even remain Christian is because one of the core Christian beliefs is that God became human to bring peace to the world. Christians believe that what was proclaimed by the prophet Isaiah was actualized in the birth of Jesus. For a child has been born for us, a son given to us. Authority rests upon his shoulders, and he is named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His authority shall grow continually, and there shall be endless peace for the throne of David and his kingdom. He will establish and uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time onward and forevermore. I would find myself walking around campus and thinking how, out of all the places in the world that God created, God became human some 43 miles away from Gaza. Our university is named after the holy woman who gave birth to the Prince of Peace. Our university is named after the Mother of God, the God who walked along the Gaza Strip, healing, eating, and being in community with the most ostracized members of society, the tax collectors, the sex workers, the people with disabilities, the sinners, and the people experiencing homelessness. And he was brutally tortured and crucified for it. Our university is named after the mother of the God who, according to the Gospel of Matthew, said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of heaven belongs." Matthew also tells us in chapter 18 that at that time the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" He called a child, whom he put among them, and said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." And Mark tells us in his gospel, "I tell you the truth, anyone who doesn't receive the kingdom of God like a child will never enter it." Then he took the children in his arms and placed his hands on their heads and blessed them. I kept asking myself, how can our university believe these things and still be complicit in the killing of at least 40,861 people? And those are just the numbers that we think are accurate. Could be many, many, many more, including in those numbers, nearly 16,000 500 children of God in Gaza killed. The hypocrisy of the words being uttered in homilies and the Catholic social teaching being emphasized in my theology classes were sickening to me. And the only remedy was to use my emotions to turn Catholic social teaching and everything I've learned in my theology and peace studies classes at Notre Dame into action. I knew that my continued grieving of my father's death, someone who had to defect our homeland of Cuba for speaking out against the repressive regime, combined with the frustration and anger generated by the hypocrisy and complicity around me, it was all calling me to act toward justice. As a student at Notre Dame, I recognized that the university's investments and collaborations with weapons manufacturers blatantly contradicted all 7 principles of Catholic social teaching: the sanctity of life and the dignity of the human person, the preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, peace and reconciliation, solidarity, care for God's creation, ethical business practices, and the promotion of justice. Furthermore, these actions violated the socially responsible investing guidelines established by the USCCB. To address these ethical breaches, divestment from companies such as Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, and other defense contractors was imperative. As a critically engaged and reflective scholar, I sought to apply CST principles to confront the injustices afflicting our world through concrete action. As a morally committed student at a prestigious Catholic university, one renowned for its leading peace studies and theology programs, it was particularly disheartening to witness the institution's reluctance to even address whether its investments involved weapons manufacturers. In such a context, I found it essential to embody and implement the principle of relationality, fostering meaningful connections and dialogue rooted in ethical responsibility. By doing so, challenge the silence and promote accountable actions. At the same time, it requires maintaining awareness of our own emotions so that we can respond with empathy, patience, and understanding. This balance of attentiveness, both to one's inner state and the needs of the other, creates a safe and nurturing environment where meaningful connection can flourish. In my life as a student, I feel a profound sense of interconnectedness between the intellectual, the emotional, and experiential dimensions of inquiry. There's undoubtedly space for generating and sustaining joy, the joy and exuberance that originally ignited my passion for this work, as these emotions fuel creativity and perseverance. In fact, maintaining that enthusiasm often deepens the learning process, allowing for more authentic engagement. Bringing the personal and the communal into the life of the university is not only possible, but I think essential. It allows for the integration of lived experiences, cultural context, and relational dynamics, enriching our learning with deeper insights. By incorporating personal narratives and communal perspectives, learning can transcend the purely academic. What does this do? It fosters a more holistic understanding of the subject matter that is both rigorous and deeply human. Holistic experience contrasts sharply with the objective meaning-making that emerged from the scientific emphasis on reason and detachment that I mentioned at the beginning. Instead of abstract third-person perspectives that treat the body as an object or an it, this approach, an embodied approach, centers on moment-to-moment experiences from within the living body. It's an inside-out, proprioceptive understanding, focusing on how our bodies feel and move, each uniquely. Embodiment involves working with, on, and through the body, recognizing that our bodies are always expressive, continuously telling our stories. By attuning to what our bodies are communicating rather than ignoring these signals, we unlock a deeper, more intuitive form of knowing. This embodied awareness not only fosters personal well-being, but also enhances our capacity for empathy, enabling us really to connect with others in more meaningful ways. Finally, reflexivity in educational settings involves the student's awareness of how their own evolving experiences and personal background shape both the learning process and its outcomes. By being mindful of how our thoughts and emotions, cultural backgrounds, our environment, and personal histories influence interactions with those we learn alongside of and the rest of humanity, we can attain the rigor that being a morally committed student demands. Reflexivity encourages us to examine our role inside and outside the classroom. And also, I would say inside and outside church walls, allowing us to better understand the dynamics of the conflicts plaguing our world. When we empower both others and ourselves, we gain a sense of empowerment and credibility, fostering richer, more reliable, more godly insights. And with this serendipitous spirit of peace building and aspiring to be a morally committed Catholic student, I'll pass it on to my dear friend Lasya to share their own reflections on involvement with student encampments. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Joryán. Thank you for your witness, and thank you for so beautifully articulating why you're here with us in this movement, why you show up every day, and what your personal journey with that has been like. So after yesterday night's session and today morning session and 3 people speaking really well on this topic, I don't have that much to say, but I would like to share with you my own experience being involved with student encampments and just some things that I'm taking away from my time with them. So I'd like to begin with talking about an instinct that I have and that I don't particularly enjoy about myself. Very often when I'm on social media and scrolling, I will come across really ghastly images of suffering from the Gaza Strip, children being bombed, arms and legs hanging off, just really, really messy, gory, heartbreaking images. And just as those images had started appearing on my phone screen in October, I was happening to walk down the main street in my college town, and I saw a bunch of students from the university dressed up for Halloween, wearing a bunch of outfits that resembled zombies and that had a lot of very similar gory parts to that costume. And I remember just walking down and being like, what is going on in my life right now? I open my phone and I see these real images of suffering. And then for some reason, this is a really popular costume to look like I don't know, you're in a state of medical distress, among other things. And my instinct in both cases is to look away because I'm someone who has visceral reactions to seeing bodily trauma. And so something I personally experience and that I hear a lot is people saying, I look away because I can't bear to look at those images of suffering. And the question I guess I ask myself pretty often, and that I ask you today, if you're one of those people, which I think a lot of us are in different circumstances, is if you saw a 5-car pileup on the highway and you know that it was going to be bad, would you choose to just look away because you didn't want to see the images or you didn't want to see the horror that was ensuing? Wouldn't you have serious judgment for someone who chose to look away in that kind of situation? Why is it different when it's on the other side of a phone screen, when it's children from the other side of the world? What is it that's inherently so different about it? And that's kind of the question that's at the core of student encampments. Student encampments are, among other things, an attempt to disrupt the norm an attempt to bring the issues that for many people feel abstract and far from home into the public eye. The encampment I was part of happened in the context of the mass displacement and destruction in Gaza, and the very physical act of pitching tents on university property was an effort to move this displacement out of the abstract into a place where people can't ignore it. Encampments represent the presence of suffering in the places we don't expect to see it, with the goal of challenging the sense of complacency or an ability to, sorry, give me 1 second, I lost my train of thought, sorry. To challenge the sense of complacency that we may all feel on this issue and or the ability to turn our eyes away and just not look at it anymore. This ability to look away is something we exercise pretty often when we see unhoused people on the road, when we see maybe interpersonal violence taking place that we don't want to get involved in, when we have to respond to cases of sexual violence in and around us. And that's inherently the same feeling that's at the heart of us wanting to look away and at the heart of student encampments wanting us to not be able to look away. In addition to this, I was incredibly moved by the ways the encampments represented a disruption of other parts of normal life. In particular, refusing to allow ourselves to close our eyes to suffering also forces us to open up the possibilities to break down particular social barriers, particularly around individualism in American society. At our encampment, we had a people's kitchen where there was always so much food to go around, and it kept magically appearing from places, and local restaurants kept dropping food off. And I ate better in that week than I have eaten in my whole time in Madison. We had a library that also seemingly sprung out of nowhere, and books just kept showing up on issues that people wanted to learn on. And I found a book about Palestinian fashion, which I am a nerd for, the sociology of popular culture. So I just sat there and read a book about Palestinian fashion, ate, food that someone had lovingly prepared for the encampment, and then went on from there to have a serious conversation about the implications of genocide in the 21st century and what it means to live through that. I sat through multiple teach-ins and learned so much, probably more than I would learn in an average course at my university. No shade to my university. I clearly like academics, and that's why I'm there, but there was so much to learn in that peer education model. And so from all of this, I guess what I'm really trying to communicate to you, and I will wrap this up in a few minutes so we have time to take a break before the mass, is a couple of things. The first, very often with social issues, you're going to be the outsider looking on. Many of us hold identities, some privileged, some marginalized. There are going to be times in your life when your marginalized identity is at the forefront and there's action happening around that and you jump in on it. But most times it's going to be something outside your own identities. Don't think that that's an invitation to not jump in on it, because you know that you would never be able to make the change that you truly desire for the world unless other people came in to help you. And it's the same for the change that other people want to see in the world. Remember that you're being watched by a cloud of witnesses. You're inspired by your spiritual ancestors. And in reality, you don't actually need to know that much to be able to tell right from wrong. I, coming in, didn't have that much knowledge about Palestine or Gaza or about anything that was going on there or about the long history of suffering there, more than, I guess, the average person, which is honestly not that much knowledge. But I did know that there was active genocide and suffering and all of these bad things happening there. And I did know that there were no universities left in Gaza. None. I knew that I was standing on the campus of an American university where, the poverty wages that I make, I pay taxes on, and that those taxes go towards enabling genocide in Gaza where there are no universities remaining. It doesn't take extraordinary gifts to be part of a movement. Even just showing up there and putting your body on the line counts. The more people who are there, the less likely the police is to brutalize people. There are also plenty of opportunities to take initiative. I didn't particularly bring any specialized skills to my encampment. I found a website where you can listen to the police scanner if you'd like to, and I listened to that for a bunch of hours. I found out that the power banks there had been discharged. And so I decided with a couple of friends to just collect all of them in a big bin and go and charge them in the library and bring them back. I found out that one day there was no gluten-free option, and so I ran to the grocery store and grabbed a gluten-free option. And so as Ruben Garcia was asking us this morning, whose permission are you waiting for? And why do you feel entitled to needing to be invited into a movement that you know is so prescient and so urgent, and something that God is calling you to be a part of today? I'll also share that you don't need to agree with everyone in the movement in order to make stuff happen with them. The mess of being part of a movement is a part of the blessing that you receive as a human being who gets to be in community with other people. I myself am exceedingly annoying when I haven't eaten in the past 3 hours. Probably during meetings, I cut people off because, you know, I'm neurodivergent like that. I probably have some takes that other people don't agree with, one of them being nonviolence. But luckily, you know, in this movement, majority of people were on board with nonviolence. But my point being, you don't have to see eye to eye with everyone on everything to know when something is wrong and to know that both of you are against that wrong thing. And so it's okay to go into this with different levels of knowledge, different ideas of how things need to go, and different levels of confidence in political institutions, if you have the clarity of what it is you desire, which in this case is an end to the genocide and a permanent ceasefire. The sheer scale of what is possible when even a small group of people step up is pretty nuts. If you had the chance to visit an encampment, I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. But like I was saying, right, like this appeared out of nowhere, that appeared out of nowhere. None of it actually appeared out of nowhere, right? Like someone took initiative. Someone was like, you know, I have an extra bookshelf in my office. Let me find a way to drag this really heavy bookshelf down to the squad so we can put books in there. Someone decided that that day, in addition to cooking for their giant family, they wanted to cook more for that encampment. All of these things appeared because someone took initiative, and most of those people weren't explicitly invited to do that. They just did it anyway. And so I invite you to just take a moment to appreciate the sheer scale of what has been possible because of the actions of students and their supporters on university campuses around the country. And amidst all of this, I'll share with you, I live with chronic fatigue every day. A lot of days I couldn't leave my house to get to the encampment. There were a gazillion Google Sheets that needed to be organized and things that needed to be listened to and people that needed to be spoken to. And so I'm wanting to tell you that even if the amount of time you can give to movement is variable, even if how much energy you can bring to the table is variable, there are always things that you are able to do, that you can do, and that you should do for that movement. And one of my last big learnings from this has been the fact that hope is both scarce and abundant when you're in that kind of environment. It is scarce because you know that day after day you've sat through this and done these things, and it doesn't seem like anything is moving on the university's front. And also it is abundant because every day you see new people show up, people showing up with their children, people showing up with the elderly, everyone showing up here for this cause, attending teach-ins, reading books, bringing food. And so you'll kind of have to hold that complexity of like, I have a lot of hope for this movement, and also it's hard. Whoops, okay, we're in the last 30 seconds. So I'll leave you with this thought. Hope is not a luxury I always have, but I choose to keep fighting anyway. Thank you so much.
I don't know about all of you, but boy, I felt like I went to church with these two wonderful, wonderful students. Thank you so much. I think you both brought just extraordinary insight and enthusiasm and gave us just an incredible way to look at how we can